Hey, it's Coach Anderson again here from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. Today we're going to look at Lesson 5 and we're going to talk briefly about the Indian Wars. And just as we always tell you, if you have a journal, what we would encourage you to do is take that journal out, write down the various questions that we'll have, where's the unit focus, the do now activities, and of course in the vocabulary. And at some point come back and refer to those questions. The unit focus question that we have for this particular unit, of course, on Selling the West is, why would people take on the challenges of moving to the West? And once again, we won't answer that question today. What we will do, of course, is look at the end of the unit as kind of a summative assessment. Today, what we're going to do is our do now activity in your journal, write down the following statement. Identify as many Indian tribes or figures as you can. We'll give you a few moments, of course, to do that, and then we'll come back and we'll find out what you wrote. Okay, you should have had plenty of time that you were able to go through, of course, and identify as many Indian tribes as you could. Of course, there's as many figures you could. When I think about if you are a big fan of Westerns, of course, it should have been a very easy activity for you to do. But just in our own state, we have the Choctaw, we have the Natchez tribe, of course, that was here, and we have the Cherokee. And then we have tribes, of course, like the Sioux, the Arapaho, the Shoshone, we had the Comanches, the Cheyenne. So when you're thinking about the various tribes, those are some of the tribes that you might, of course, come to mind. In terms of looking at some of the figures, you could think about people like Sitting Bull, of course, Geronimo, who was an Apache chief out in the Southwest. And then, of course, people like Crazy Horse, Black Kettle, Red Cloud. And we're going to talk about some of those native figures here in a few moments. What we have for you also is the vocabulary. Once again, we'll try to address the vocabulary as it comes up, and if by chance we miss it, just write it down, of course, and you can look it up yourself. Lesson focus question for lesson number 5, we have one question. It says, what effect did westward migration have on the Plains Indians? And we'll talk about that and be thinking about that, of course, as we go through this particular lesson, so you can kind of formulate what your own response would be. All right, when we look at the Plains, it was inhabited by a few tribes, the Sioux, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the Comanche, and the Kiowa. They were nomadic people, which means that they moved from place to place. In most cases, they followed their food. They followed wherever, of course, the buffalo went. The influx of migrants into the area caused conflict over land ownership and would lead to an effort by the federal government to relocate the native people, of course, to reservations or agencies that they sometimes called them. Here's a map of some of the Indian wars that happened as a result of disputes between the federal government, of course, and the Native Americans. And you'll notice, of course, that throughout the midsection of the Great Plains region of the United States of America, there were a great many of these Indian wars. Because remember, in the beginning, we didn't think that the Great Plains, of course, was very, very valuable land. But when we find out that it is very valuable land, we're going to find that a lot of people are going to move into this particular area. And then you throw in, on top of that, the finding of gold, it even becomes even worse for the Native American. The Dakota Sioux Uprising is one of the first incidences where we have conflict between the Native American, of course, and the federal and the settlers. And it happened in 1862, and it was one of the most violent conflicts that occurred between the Sioux and Minnesota settlers. The Sioux agreed to go to the reservation or the agency in exchange for annuities or payments that they didn't receive. And when they didn't receive them, of course, then they left, and it led, of course, to some violence between them, which ended up, of course, with settlers, death of several settlers, and then 38 natives, of course, were sentenced to death over those settlers, of course, that were killed. It was the first significant Indian battle on the plains. The Red Cloud's War. Red Cloud, of course, was one of the Dakota chiefs of the Sioux. And he, in 1866, along with Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, led a massacre of William Fetterman and 80 American soldiers. It would mark the official start of Native resistance to American settler encroachment into the Dakotas. Here's a picture of Lakota chief, Sioux chief, Red Cloud. Here is William Fetterman. He and those 80 troops, of course, were massacred, of course, by Red Cloud, of course, Sitting Bull, of course, and Crazy Horse. In 1864, tensions between the Arapaho and Cheyenne against the miners and the settlers in the area led to the massacre of more than 200 settlers. The desire for land and the lure of gold and silver caused the conflict, and the conflict led to Black Kettle and the Cheyenne being massacred at Sand Creek. So what we're seeing here is violence begetting violence. So whenever the native, of course, does something to push back, there's violence against him. And whenever the white settlers or any other settlers, of course, that move into other, because you had African American settlers, of course, that moved in also, and other immigrants from Europe, there's going to be tension, because what you have is the federal government is saying, of course, on the Homestead Act, you can have this land, but the Native American, of course, doesn't understand those concepts. Here's a picture of the Cheyenne chief Black Kettle. Here's a picture of John Chivington, who led that massacre, of course, at Sand Creek. And then here we have, of course, is the failed plans to end the Indian Wars. There was some attempt by the federal government, of course, to kind of end the wars by negotiating, of course, with the native and with the native. The Indian Commission was created to ease tensions between settlers and Indians by negotiating treaties between the two sides. But it never really panned out. The natives' idea of ownership of land was a little bit different from the settlers. The native didn't know that anybody could own the land. He thought, of course, that he could go wherever he wanted to go. Well, if you were a farmer, of course, you had a pretty good idea of what your land rights were and what your land boundaries were. But that didn't stop the native, of course, from wandering onto your land in some cases. And those kind of disagreements or kind of calculations, I guess, would in some cases, because neither one of them had a good understanding about what it is they were supposed to be doing, especially the native, it would lead to conflict in some cases. So Indian mistrust of the government, corrupt traders, and treaties increased as they fell into poverty and despair by being forced onto the reservations. The reservation system itself, or the agency system, was the government's attempt to solve the Indian issue by placing them on reservations. By 1870, most tribes were resolved to leave the reservation to regain their way of life. They didn't want to be on the reservation because the reservation, of course, went against everything that they were about, being nomadic, going where their food went, and if they stayed on the reservation, that meant that they couldn't live the way that they used to live in terms of depending or having even a stable food supply. The resurgence of the Indian Wars. By the 1870s, we're going to find that the Indian Wars, of course, the second kind of phase of it, of course, to kind of kick off. And it's going to end, of course, with George Armstrong Custer and Little Bighorn. And it's going to be kind of one of those watershed moments in the history of the United States of America when it comes to the Indian Wars. We're going to see what happens, of course, to Custer, and then it's going to be renewed energy to fix the Indian problem. Here is a picture of the Battle of Little Bighorn, or Custer's last stand. At this time, students, we will take a brief break, and we would like to allow you time to access the video in the video description and take a first-hand account of one of the chiefs at the Battle of Little Bighorn. He details how Yellowhair, or Custer, fought with great bravery that day. Enjoy the video. Local account. In 1877, the Nez Perce Indians, led by Chief Joseph, fled to Canada to avoid being sent to a smaller reservation. Chief Joseph was able to see that resistance against the American government was too difficult, and he led his people to a reservation in October of 1877. So he initially leaves the country and takes his people across to Canada because he understands that the settlers were going to keep on coming. And because they were going to keep on coming, there was no way that they could, or anything that they could do, of course, to prevent that. So in his mind, the best thing to do, of course, was to flee and go across to Canada. He eventually, of course, makes his way back to the agency, of course, or the reservation in Oklahoma in 1877. Here's a picture of Chief Joseph, the Nez Perce chief. And here's a picture of the ghost dance. Now, the ghost dance is going to be one of those things that's going to cause some issues between the native and the federal government. The native performs the ghost dance because he wants a return to the way things used to be. He wants to be able to see his ancestors again, return to his old way of life, and then he's also dancing, of course, for the return of the buffalo. So when you look at that, that's, in their minds, it was a ceremonial dance. In the case of the federal government, they thought it was a threat, of course, against settlers. And as a result, it leads to the tragedy at Wounded Knee. In December of 1890, the final Indian resistance came to an end when approximately 200 Sioux and Chief Sitting Bull were killed by American soldiers. The tragedy started because natives were performing the ghost dance ritual that they hoped would make settlers disappear and the buffalo return. I guess you can see if you were a settler and you said, were they performing, of course, to make the settlers disappear, you can see how it would be perceived as being a threat, of course. A Century of Dishonor. There was a lady, of course, by the name of Helen Hunt Jackson, who wrote a book called A Century of Dishonor. And what she basically did is she blames the federal government for the problems that led to the Indian Wars what she recounted, of course, was all the broken promises that were made, of course, to the Native American. She doesn't, of course, she kind of takes a slanted approach to it. She doesn't necessarily look at both sides of the coin because there was some blame, of course, to be had on both sides. And here's a picture of Helen Hunt Jackson, who wrote the book A Century of Dishonor. You can't talk about the Great Plains and the buffalo and the Native Indians without talking about Buffalo Bill Cody. He was an Army Scout, showman, Pony Express rider, buffalo hunter. And because of efforts of people like Buffalo Bill Cody, of course, who leads these hunts, of course, of the buffalo on the Great Plains, we're going to find that the buffalo is going to all but be wiped out. Americanization efforts. Now, we talked about the Dawes Act a few seconds ago, and those two films, that film, of course, was about the Dawes Act. The purpose of it, once again, was to make the native a Christian farmer. Break up the reservation system, give them land, of course, to live on, and then, of course, they would be accepted, of course, to adopt, the ways of the settlers, Christian settlers. Now, the problem is going to be they're going to take the Dawes Act and they're going to, federal government won't use it properly. When they break up the reservation systems, one of the things that they also do is they take land from the reservation system and don't necessarily give it to the Native American, they give it to settlers who want and desire that land as well. So these allotments didn't just go to the, native. In some cases, they went to settlers also. Assimilation failure. The Dawes Act proved to be a failure to assimilate the Indian, and few stayed on the allotments for the required 25 years to qualify for citizenship. In 1924, the government passed the Citizenship Act, granting natives citizenships and restored most reservations where Indians were allowed to live and elect their own tribal government. And even today, natives, of course, can live on the reservations, and they have a separate judicial system, a state judicial system they have a judicial system within the state and within the United States of America where state governments, of course, don't get involved, or city governments don't get involved, of course, with the running of things, of course, that happen on the reservation. They have their own police and jurisprudence. Here is a picture of one of those, products of assimilation. His name is Jim Thorpe. He he left his family, of course, and was sent to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where he is educated, turned and assimilated. He becomes known as one of the world's greatest athletes. He will participate in the Olympics. He will play football for Canton. He will be widely recognized as the best athlete for the first half of the 20th century. Here's our lesson focus question. A lesson focus question about the Plains Indians, once again, in the Indian Wars is: what effect did the westward migration have on the Plains Indians? We'll give you a few moments, of course, to look at that question, contemplate and answer. In a few seconds, we'll come back and we'll come back and find out, of course, what you found. Okay, you should have been able to go through and look at that particular question. And this is some of the answers, I think, is a portion of the answer that I would start to formulate, and yours doesn't have to necessarily be like mine, but it could be something that involves something like this. What effect did the Western migration have on the Plains Indians? It forced them to settle on the reservation. They lived in poverty and faced starvation. They were forced to assimilate and become farmers. And then, of course, we find that doesn't necessarily come to fruition, but that's what, of course, happened. We'll give you a couple of practice questions, of course, that'll help you on the map test. And the first question is: how did supporters of the Dawes Act of 1877 expect it to affect Native Americans? A, by relocating Native American tribes further west. B, by assimilating Native American to white culture. B, by strengthening tribal identities among Native Americans. D, by recognizing equal rights of citizenship for Native Americans. And the answer is by assimilating Native Americans to white culture. Next question, it says Native American land holdings fell from 138 million acres in 1887 to 48 million acres in 1934. What explains the reduction in the amount of land owned by Native Americans during this time? A, the Dawes Act allowed the federal government to sell surplus land to non-Native Americans. B, the federal government purchased most land owned by Native Americans through the Homestead Act. C, many Native Americans gave up farming because the Morrill Act provided free training and skilled trades. D, the Interstate Commerce Act encouraged entrepreneurs to build factories on land and brought from Native Americans. Give you a couple of moments, look at it, and if you did, the answer would be the Dawes Act. A. Well, that is the end of lesson number 5, of course, the settlement of the plains in the unit, and then, of course, the lesson was the Indian Wars. We hope we gave you some insights in terms of the struggles of the Native Americans and the struggles of American settlers, too, and the struggles of the federal government, to come up with a solution to the Native problem. We're going to find that it's going to affect the history of this particular country even to today. So when we're looking at the problem with the Indian Wars or the divisions, of course, in the country that they create, we need to understand that it was a very complex situation, and there were no simple answers, of course, for it. What we have told you, like we always do, we hope you enjoyed the lesson today, and remember, don't take my word for it, do your own research, because it's America's history, and because it's America's history, it's your history. So if you will, go ahead and do your research and have a great day, and we hope to see you again next time.